My talk is on the pyramid of sustainability, and I'll show you that device in a moment, what I mean by the pyramid. It's an analytical way to deal with some of the issues that as businesses we have to contend with. But really to start the discussion, and using the kind of analogy of a Russian doll idea, I'm going to start with the globe and kind of work all the way down to the regions and to just put out some of the issues that are out there and what I would call a signal, and the signal that we have in our globe at the moment, the signal that is actually impacting our economy and ultimately our businesses and regions. And then try to distinguish that from the noise. There's a lot of noise, a lot of things that distracts us, but we mustn't lose sight of the signal. So just to start at the very broad base of what's happening in the globe, the signal is fundamentally this. In our generation, since 1980, half of the world has become contestable capitalists. Before 1980, people were locked away in communist regimes, not engaging. And during this lifetime, we've seen the emergence of India, China, Eastern Europe become contestable capitalists. The consequence of that means that there's more labor, the costs of goods and the delivery of goods have lost their value in the main. We go back 12 years, we'd have seen that the top companies in the world were companies that had physical assets, natural resources, really important driver of that. Still crucially important today, but it's been supplanted by the fact that services and the embodiment in those services of intellectual property, be they brands, copyrights, patents, now drive the value of the business in the world. We've seen a shift from goods being a significant part in the basket of households to now services being the majority and the big value driver. So this doesn't mean that there's no value in goods. It just means that it's become much more of a competitive issue in jurisdictions around the world, the emergence of China, India, and Eastern Europe, providing those goods and services. That's the signal. That signal is no way yet complete and will be the signal for the rest of our working lives, is that we'll see that shift away from goods being the primary driver to services, moving from tangible assets to intangible assets being the driver. And Ireland, which I'll talk about later on, and we've talked for many years about this, is now at a frontier economy driven by that phenomenon. That's the signal. When we start to move a little bit closer to home and look at the European Union, we can see a lot of issues going on in the European Union as it declines as a population in the globe. We're seeing that pivot shift that I just talked about towards Asia. We've seen that in even over the COVID period, where Western democracies and countries have actually had a bad COVID economically in trying to coordinate. But also we're seeing that reaction against what were multilateral trade agreements to now much more bilateral or individual agreements being hammered out. Europe really needs to move to this intangibility story, and we have a lot of tension right now in Europe between the US, Europe, and China, really around the intangible nature that is data. We've seen the Schrems case this year. We've seen some of the trade wars on the back of how Europe is seen to deal with the intangible companies that are the FANGs, for instance. These tensions are reflections of what I talked about at the start, the fundamental change of that signal coming from the fact that the globe has become contestable capitalism. That signal in Europe, clearly in terms of trade deal, goes to the heart of when Europe has lost a G8 member from the club. Stand back from it. We get caught up in Brexit. It is still the case that what we're witnessing right now is the leaving of the club of what was potentially the most dynamic large country in the last generation. Britain was on track to be the biggest member state of the European Union. That's a significant shift and pull away. A lot of the argument at the moment is all about Europe is strong, Europe is big, it's Britain that's having the problems here. This is a problem for both parties. We can come back to what's happening at the moment in terms of a trade deal and the necessity for that trade deal. But that necessity is also going to require that Europe, our home, where we're based, is really going to have to tackle some of its fundamental issues, and I'll bring that out in this pyramid as well. One of the issues that you'll see in that pyramid when I get to it is the underlying institutions. And one of the most fundamental institutions for capitalism is property rights. Can you have universal property rights? Are they transferable? Are they enforceable? All of these issues are important for businesses to have the certainty to know where your assets are and can you trade on them. And if the rule of law comes under pressure, as it is now in parts of the European Union, this is a very significant eroding of the competitive base for business. So let's not get suckered into thinking this is all Britain's problem. This is a European problem right now that we're grappling with on those elements. Moving a little bit closer again into the two islands. The relationship between Ireland and Britain is going to be fundamental. Brexit has happened. The 31st of January, Britain, the United Kingdom more accurately, left the European Union. That's an economic order shift. At the moment, we're really just dealing with the first round of transactional and transitional arrangements and details. But fundamentally, that has changed the economic order for Ireland economically as well. It's going to take some time before that emerges, but it will have many aspects to it, not least the competitiveness aspect, where Britain will be, and has been, the most significant competitor for Ireland in dealing with these intangible assets and balance sheets that I talked about. Then we come to the all-island dimension, and clearly with the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland arising from Brexit and the Good Friday Agreement, we now have this strange scenario where Northern Ireland will be both within the European Union and in the UK simultaneously. That's going to mean that it will be at the center of three really significant and potential trade deals that may not get done, but we need them to be done in the next 5 years. The trade deals are between the UK and the EU. The UK want to have a trade deal with the US, but more fundamentally, Europe and the US really need to do a trade deal with each other. Again, because of that locus of activity, as I talked about at the start, of the pivot shift towards Asia. It's important that the EU and the US today, being the hegemony in terms of the trade, need to solidify that in a modern context, and that involves capital and services as much as it does goods. So we need the TTIP to be reinstated. The Biden presidency probably creates that opportunity. But Northern Ireland will appear in all three trade deals. It is at the locus of these deals. And so that factor, I think, gets insufficient attention from the business community right now. The other sting in the tail from that protocol is that Northern Ireland will have to make a decision every 4 years on whether it wants to stay with this arrangement. And 4 years out now to 2025, that's another moment in time, a mini Brexit on this island, because in what would seem the irrational response at this point to give up that benefit of the best of both worlds. But we know Brexit also suffered from that same assumption that Britain wouldn't walk away, is that if we get a situation where Northern Ireland decides it doesn't want to be in the EU, then the issues about borders on the island come flooding back at us. We don't wait till 2025 for that moment. It is in all our interest to start that dialogue about how to move this new arrangement forward during the 4 years to obviate that threat, and that we can move this on to be an opportunity that it is. Then moving to the Republic of Ireland. Well, what we're seeing here is that the signal and the momentum of the economy remains incredibly strong. I've gone a long way without mentioning COVID too much, but clearly COVID, in my view, tragedy as it is just a noise issue. It is not a signal. The issues that we got new normals and so on, these were trends that were there that may have been amplified, but they haven't been solidified. There'll be lots of flux in terms of people want to get back to the office and new arrangements and blending. But these aren't structural issues. These are just arrangements and new channels of the supply side reacting. We've seen channels change during the year on the demand side, how retailers manage to get their products, how publicans manage to get their pints back out onto the street. We see different people reacting in different ways. But these aren't fully structural issues. These aren't the signal necessarily. But the signal in Ireland has been very strong the last 6 years because we've been a real beneficiary of that trend towards intangibility. Irish GDP has doubled in the last 6 years. Irish GDP looks like it won't have gone down during 2020. It'll have bucked a trend internationally. In fact, if it's going in any direction, it's potentially a positive growth rate for the year 2020. That seems remarkable, given that we've had so much talk about restrictions and existential crisis for particular sectors. But the reality is, in this kind of K-shaped recovery we've experienced, has been experienced internationally, the upward arm of that K-shape in Ireland has really been huge. We've seen industrial base increase by 18% year on year, reflected in the pharma, medtech, tech, food and drink. But even within retail, the experience of the 12 categories of retail, 4 have suffered really badly in terms of the restaurants, the pubs, the department stores, the bookshops. But in the other 8 categories, it's been growth, and for some, it's been record growth. So when we look at the economy, we're seeing some different tales in there. But the narrative that this has been a disastrous year for business on the demand side just doesn't hold. On the supply side, there's been disruptions, and people have been uncomfortable, and we don't know the full cost dynamically for that. So let me talk about this pyramid of sustainability and what it might mean for the regions as well in terms of how we reallocate. So I might bring up the pyramid here. And this is really on the back of work that the National Competitive Councils would have done in putting this framework of a pyramid. But what I'd like to maybe just give the initial conditions. What's the base? What's the bedrock? And you could really say that there's 3 kind of blocks here. There's the institutions. And what I mean by institutions, these are what you're left with. So arguably Ireland was left with really strong institutions back at the cessation of being a member of the United Kingdom 100 years ago. So we're left with a public administration system, we're left with educational systems, we were left with a taxation system that worked, and so on. We were left with quite good institutions for a new nascent country. Part of those institutions is the rule of law. And the common law legal system that we still have today has proved to be hugely beneficial in this modern world of intangible assets being the new currency. Because common law legal systems, in contrast to codified systems, which they have in mainland Europe, are much more interpretive, are able to take innovation a lot quicker. And that gives us a sustainability of precedents and so on. That's one fundamental institution that most people in business tend to forget about. Property rights and the underpinning that, crucial for institutions. Similarly, we'll come on a little later, we'll talk about skills and education. And again, institutions for this state fundamentally would have come from the church. And so we, as a developing society back 100 years ago, we didn't effectively have a Department of Education nor a Department of Health from the state. It was religious orders that provided those institutions and are still very active in our society today. These institutions are often ignored at our peril unless you're capable of putting substitutes in place in an efficient way. So disruptions to our institutions and rule of law mechanisms are quite serious issues. And we've seen a few of those develop here in Ireland over the last number of decades on the institutional side and more recently on our court system. The institutions, though, in Ireland have been strong and have been a real advantage to us. The other feature then is to have a stable economic policy, stable public finances. This we haven't been good at. We've gone through financial crisis after financial crisis. Generally, every half a generation, we seem to have a public finance crisis. There used to be balance of payments crisis in the 30s, 40s, 50s. We've managed to stay the ship on the balance of payments crisis by our foreign direct investment model, where now we're a world leader in terms of exports, and we don't have these balance of payments problems since probably the middle of the 1980s. On the public finances, we tend to go through these cycles, but being a member of the European Union and the rules of the European Union for fiscal policy have given us some guardrails, but we still have some tensions that develop. We're only 12 years or so away from the financial crisis. Right now, we're in a solid place, and I'll come back to the underpinnings of that public finance in a moment. So again, those bedrocks really strong. By endowments here, we mean usually what resources do we have? So tragically, our society, the only endowments we had, and we exported them, were live things, people and cows. And that right up to 1967, our largest export was actually live cattle. So in one generation, we've seen the spectacular change in our society that is reflective of what's happening in the world. Other societies have transformed as well, but we've certainly done it in a much more dramatic way because we didn't have endowments of post-industrialization. We had very little brownfield sites with very little problems between labor and capital, between proletariat and bourgeois. We were very petty bourgeois, using those institutions of the state like education to change social class, but also we had the advantage that when we skipped the industrial revolutions 1, 2, and 3, we were suddenly perfect for industrialization 4.0. And that's really driving our regions right now. We see incredible examples of the industrialization that's taken place in Ireland. And going back to the thing that drove us this year, that 18% growth in industrial, that is from the investment that's gone in to those areas. So these endowments are really important. So not having the fortune of having coal, oil, and gas, that's why we missed the other industrial revolutions. This type of industrial revolution, when it's about ideas and technicality and lateral thinking, Ireland is really strong. So the essential conditions for sustainability, widely defined, not just environmental, but more fundamental sustainability, gives rise to what are the inputs for that sustainable proposition. And so again, here, the kind of factors are the business environment. Is it a business-friendly society? Well, fundamentally, that goes back to the institutions as well. Can you be certain that when you make an investment in Ireland, that the natives don't go and steal it or encumber it some way? So encumbering off, being able to get your product out of the factory. Are there people protesting outside the gates, stopping you move? Are there people protesting at ports, stopping you move? Is there changes to the law in terms of the ownership structure? These things we just assume in Ireland. These aren't assumed anymore, even within the European Union, where the issues of rule of law, where at the moment maybe on social issues, can very quickly firmly move towards the economic assets as well. Europe has experienced these changes. We missed the Industrial Revolution in the last century. There were no assets really to fight over in Ireland. Not the case in mainland Europe. And so we see the move to collective ownership, to communism, to taking of assets. These things are fundamentally important. And when the world gets into a flux as we're in right now, we need to make sure that we keep the base, keep the essential conditions, but also on the inputs, make sure that we continue to have a business-friendly environment, but also a stable one. The other feature then that we've learned, and again are a great success, is the clustering of firms and the sophistication in firms. And we've seen this even in the last 2 years. In 2019, investment by firms in Ireland reached 163 billion euros. Now you throw out a number, you kind of glaze over. There's only 5 million of us in the Republic of Ireland. We touched that milestone over the summer. The 163 billion is an investment in a single year by firms in terms of machinery and equipment, building and construction, and the investment in these intangible assets of the patents, brands, copyrights, corporate balance sheets moving in here. That is 3 billion euros a week. 3 billion euros a week of investment. As business people, we know that investment is put in to have a recurring income, to have a P&L extraction in time. And we've seen that P&L extraction. That's what GDP is correlated to. It's effectively capturing that base effect. The level of sophistication and the level of clustering is really, truly world class, but it's also world significant. And we've seen the role that Ireland has played in COVID, in the manufacturing initially and the ventilators, but now more dramatically in terms of the vaccines and all of the ancillary inputs that go into this global effort. Ireland is completely outsized and disproportionate in its impact for 5 million people in now heading for an 8,000 million world. That sophistication then is on our physical and natural resources. And the physical resources here will be the infrastructures we put in place. And again, we've been slow to make those investments. Our population is rising, but the physical investment in infrastructure to provide the housing, the transportation systems, the water, the energy that Ian talked about earlier on, we're not keeping pace with what's happening in the private sector in terms of its investment. And that mismatch is going to bite us. 2021 is going to be a really significant year in the housing market. Demand is going to be huge. The money is in our society. The savings were there, but now have been absolutely amplified during 2020. And yet the supply side, the stock of houses, aren't available. We will see what the predictions for prices in housing will be but I can't see them other than be rocketing upwards. That will have a feedback loop in terms of demands in our workplaces, in terms of wage demands, in terms of flexibility, and maybe the relocation out of expensive urban areas into home living may dissipate some of that, but we don't see the housing stock available in the regions. There's no overhang in any part of our country now. Those ghost estates that some wanted to bulldoze a few years ago are no longer available to any great extent in the country. So we still have this housing crisis as a physical asset. Our natural resources, our greenness, so on, it can be a real game changer for us in terms of that perception, but we have to make it pristine. And we see that some of the stats on that are pretty poor. We haven't been great at our natural resources. As Ian was pointing out in gas being an exhaustible resource, it's great to see the technology to be able to make that renewable. And renewable really is going to help our sustainability. Moving away from a model of exhausting resources to making them renewable and replenishing, we have huge opportunities. And being an island nation, the solar, the wave, the tidal, we can be energy sufficient and we can actually export that. But again, it's going to require that level of investment in the physical resources. The last piece in those inputs is this knowledge and talent. And here we need to be careful that we don't believe our own hype. Irish people are quite lateral in thinking, but as they get richer, like other societies, there tends to be a leaning out, or maybe a staying in too long in education and pushing it on for longer and longer. This is a phenomenon that does nothing bad in itself. It's great as long as it doesn't undermine your sustainability and competitiveness. And so we have to ensure that the knowledge and talent is actually tapped into what are the emerging technologies, what are the actual trends, and do we have an educational system that's fit for purpose? If we continue to keep stuffing in people into universities, the market has a very obvious response. Oversupply, the returns are less to those individuals. Those who don't go that route into skills, apprenticeships and so on will become more premium and their wages will go up to reflect that. That's actually really emergent in the Irish economy right now in terms of who's getting the returns. And this idea of an expectorate, I suppose you might call them, is the capacity to move into being an elite in a society by the mere fact that you went to university and got into a branded corporation no longer holds. And no small part globally of the tensions we're experiencing in terms of the social angst about how capitalism is working is not so much the obvious one of the haves and the have-nots. It's those who have and have, but their expectation in having is that they expected more. And there just isn't, in these pyramids that we see all the time, enough room at the top to satiate everybody. Ireland, I would contend, is experiencing this right now. And part of that I would call a bit of a lean out occurring. We're seeing a lot more leisure being taken. We're seeing a lot more people not participating in the labour market. And that trend is actually, I would argue, probably been exacerbated during COVID in 2020. From these essential conditions and outputs to kind of get towards the end here, business performance is a function then of that business environment and the institutions and the endowments of the stable economic environment. Business performance in Ireland has been really strong. Productivity has been really high. The question is the productivity as a result of the capital investment, or did everybody get super bright in Ireland over the last 6 years? I think you know the answer to that question, but a lot of people don't. They think they're God's gift to the labour market and expect the returns to come from that. And as long as the capital and that story of productivity continues on, that will justify the wages and salaries. But there's always a day when the tide goes out. Does the costs justify the productivity? This is the obsession of the Competitiveness Council. So productivity and costs need to be aligned. But increasingly, sustainability is now about the environment and the natural environment. And so one of the outcomes, one of the costs are the emissions. The emissions of carbon, people tend to focus in on quite heavily. But a bit like the health outcomes, if you focus in on COVID and ignore everything else, you can get a partial view of the world. Carbon's really important, but nitrates are important, sulfur, whole host of environmental factors that we need a smorgasbord of indicators to ensure that we're actually not undermining our business model in terms of its sustainability. And employment, the nature of employment, I gave some indication of that about whether it's skilled, unskilled, semi-skilled, or managerial, clerical, whatever, is the employment paradigm and the pyramid is changing quite dramatically. When you build all these up, you're coming to this objective. The objective used to be just sustainable growth. It's now sustainable development. Never in the history of Ireland have all of these things at a moment in time been absolutely positive for us. And that's why we've ended up in a situation where in the last 6 years, the disposable income of an Irish household has moved to be nearly 50% higher than the UK. It's an incredible statistic driven on what we've experienced the last 6 years. The problem is when we all live with each other, we're kind of looking at our own relativities. But if you actually look what's happened to Ireland relative to other countries, and our neighbour being the classic example, we see that dramatically. And finally, Owen, is just passing over, think about the summer. The Republic of Ireland was able to pay a social welfare payment, the pandemic unemployment payment, at €350, in contrast to €100 in the UK or even north of the border. That's 3.5x. And did they do it for 2 weeks or 3 weeks? No. Capacity to be able to sustainably pay that to 500,000-600,000 people. Hopefully we won't have to do it, but I think the state could do it for the entire 2021. Don't want that to happen because that would be a very serious problem for everybody. But anyhow, it's a reflection of the strength of that pyramid right now.
Listen, Danny, thanks a million for that. Plenty of people have been getting in touch already.